Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know him, you've heard the I Have a Dream speech, but we're going deeper than that today, exploring the enduring legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
It's a legacy that continues to shape our world in profound ways.
Definitely. And we've got some fascinating source material that really gets into why Dr. King's work is so relevant today.
It's amazing how his ideas about nonviolent resistance, social justice, and economic equality still resonate so powerfully.
It really is. So to kick things off, let's go back to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. What were some of the key factors that led to Dr. King's rise as a leader during that era?
Well, the mid 20th century was a real boiling point for racial tensions in America. Segregation was the norm, and the fight for basic civil rights was gaining serious momentum. Dr. King emerged during this period not just as a charismatic speaker, but as a brilliant strategist, and his philosophy of nonviolence, deeply rooted in his Christian faith and inspired by Gandhi, really set him apart.
Right, and that faith wasn't just a personal thing for him, it really informed his actions.
Exactly. He believed in the inherent dignity and worth of every human being, regardless of race or social standing. And this belief fueled his unwavering commitment to nonviolent resistance. He saw it as a moral imperative, not just a tactic.
And that resonated with people, didn't it? Not just across the country, but internationally as well. It led to some incredible victories like the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington.
Absolutely. Those are pivotal moments in the civil rights movement, and they helped pave the way for landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Our source material highlights how monumental those achievements were. They really reshaped the legal landscape in America.
They did. They dismantled many aspects of Jim Crow segregation. But as our source points out, these were not the end of the journey, but rather important steps on a much longer road toward equality.
And speaking of that journey toward equality, there's this one quote from the source material that I found so powerful. It says, "Individuals should be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." It's such a simple idea, yet so revolutionary.
It really is. It challenges us to look beyond superficial differences and to see each other as human beings worthy of respect and dignity.
But that fight for a just society is far from over, right? Our source material doesn't shy away from the fact that systemic racism is still a major problem today, impacting things like policing, housing, and education.
That's a sobering reality. We've made progress since the days of Jim Crow, but the legacy of systemic racism continues to affect the lives of millions of people.
It's almost like Dr. King could see the future,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Like these challenges we're facing now, they were already on his radar back then.
He had a deep understanding of how social injustice works. He recognized that true equality would require more than just changing laws. It would require dismantling the systems of oppression that perpetuate inequality.
So how did Dr. King's vision extend beyond just racial equality? I know our source material touches on his work with the Poor People's Campaign, which seems especially relevant now with the growing wealth gap we're seeing.
The Poor People's Campaign was a testament to Dr. King's belief that racial justice and economic justice were inseparable. He understood that true equality meant addressing both. The campaign was a multiracial movement aimed at alleviating poverty and demanding economic rights for all Americans.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
He was tackling these issues way back then. What were some of the specific goals of the Poor People's Campaign, and how do they connect to the economic disparities we see today?
Well, the campaign focused on some pretty key demands. Things like a guaranteed annual income access to quality health care, affordable housing, and job creation programs. Dr. King saw these as fundamental human rights. He recognized that poverty disproportionately affected communities of color and that addressing economic inequality was crucial for achieving racial justice.
And that message is even more relevant today, right? With the gap between the rich and poor widening at such an alarming rate.
It is. Dr. King's work wasn't confined to a specific time or place. His vision for a just and equitable society transcended those boundaries, and it continues to inspire movements for change all over the world. And it's incredible how Dr. King's message resonated far beyond the U.S. He became a global symbol of hope and resistance.
Absolutely. Our source material even talks about how his work influenced movements like the fight against apartheid in South Africa. I mean, it's huge.
It really is. His ideas about nonviolence, his courage in the face of oppression, they inspired so many people around the world who were fighting their own battles for freedom and equality.
It's amazing how one person can have such a ripple effect. But, it wasn't just about those big global movements. Dr. King always emphasized the importance of individual action, too, like what we do in our everyday lives.
Right. He understood that real change comes from the ground up. It starts with individuals making conscious choices, challenging the status quo, speaking up for what's right. He often said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Yeah, that's a powerful quote. It reminds me that we all have a responsibility to do something. We can't just stand by and watch injustice happen.
Exactly. And that responsibility starts with each of us. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world, making conscious choices in our daily lives, challenging prejudice, speaking up for those who are marginalized, supporting efforts to dismantle systems of oppression.
So let's talk about some concrete ways people can actually make a difference. Our source material mentions criminal justice reform as a key area. What are some of the specific challenges within the system that we need to address?
Well, we're still dealing with the legacy of mass incarceration, which disproportionately impacts communities of color. And there are so many factors that contribute to this: racial profiling, biased policing practices, mandatory minimum sentencing laws that have just led to overcrowded prisons and torn apart countless families.
It's heartbreaking to think about the human cost of those policies. So
Right.
what can we do to push for real reform?
There are a lot of organizations out there doing amazing work advocating for changes in legislation, sentencing guidelines, and policing practices. We can support them, donate our time, contact our elected officials, and let them know that we care about these issues. And of course, educating ourselves and others about the systemic biases in the criminal justice system is crucial.
It's not just about changing laws, though, is it? It's about changing hearts and minds, too.
You're absolutely right. It's about creating a culture that values rehabilitation over punishment, recognizing the inherent dignity of every person no matter their past mistakes.
So beyond criminal justice, what are some other areas where Dr. King's vision for economic justice is still so relevant today? Our source material talked about the widening wealth gap, something the Poor People's Campaign was trying to address back in the 60s.
Yeah, Dr. King saw how poverty disproportionately affected communities of color. He understood that racial justice and economic justice are two sides of the same coin.
So how can we disrupt those cycles of poverty and inequality? It feels like such a massive problem.
It is complex, but there are steps we can take. We can advocate for policies that promote economic opportunity for everyone, investing in quality education, creating jobs that pay a living wage, providing access to affordable housing and healthcare. Those are all things that can make a real difference.
I know there's been a lot of talk lately about the racial wealth gap. How does that fit into this conversation?
The racial wealth gap is a direct result of systemic racism. It reflects centuries of discrimination that have prevented people of color from building wealth.
And that gap has a huge impact. It affects everything from education and homeownership to health and life expectancy.
Exactly. Closing that gap requires a multifaceted approach, addressing discriminatory lending practices, investing in minority-owned businesses, creating policies that promote equal access to education, healthcare, and housing. It's a big task.
It can feel overwhelming,
Yeah.
but I keep coming back to the idea that even small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely. Every time we choose to challenge prejudice, to support businesses owned by people of color, to donate to organizations fighting for economic justice, we're contributing to a more equitable world.
Yeah, it can definitely feel overwhelming at times. But I think it's important to remember that even small actions can have a big impact, especially when we all work together.
Exactly. Like that quote, be the change you wish to see in the world.
Well, yeah, a bit cliche, but true.
It is. It reminds us that we all have the power to make a difference. We don't have to wait for someone else to fix things. We can start by changing ourselves, our own choices and actions.
Right. And even just having those conversations,
Yeah.
about race and inequality
Mm-hmm.
with family and friends,
Mm-hmm.
even if it gets a little uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Discomfort can be a good thing. Sometimes it's what pushes us to grow. And if we want to build a truly just and equitable society, we have to be willing to challenge our own biases, to listen to other people's experiences.
So for our listeners who are feeling inspired and want to get involved but maybe aren't sure where to start, what advice would you give them?
Well, first I'd say get curious. Learn more about the history of the civil rights movement. Read Dr. King's writings. Explore the work that's being done today to fight for racial and economic justice. There are so many resources out there: books, documentaries, podcasts, online forums, you name it.
Yeah, immerse yourself in the knowledge. Let it fuel your passion.
Exactly. And once you have a better understanding of the issues, you can start looking for ways to get involved in your community. Find an organization that's working on something you care about and see how you can contribute.
It's so important to remember that change starts at the local level.
It really does. Whether you're volunteering your time, donating to a cause, spreading awareness, every little bit helps.
Yeah, you don't have to do everything, but you can do something.
And you don't have to be perfect either. Nobody has all the answers. It's about showing up, being willing to learn and grow along the way.
Right. It's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. Dr. King's legacy reminds us that even when things seem really tough, hope is essential. It's what keeps us going, what motivates us to keep fighting for a better world.
He showed us what's possible when people come together to demand change.
And his message was more than just a dream. It was a call to action, a challenge to build a more just and equitable society, brick by brick, through our everyday choices.
It's a legacy of hope and responsibility that we can all carry forward. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought from Dr. King himself. He said, "The time is always right to do what is right."
It's a powerful reminder that we don't have to wait for the perfect moment or the perfect opportunity. Just start where you are with what you have and make a difference.
And remember, you're not alone in this. There are so many people who share your passion for justice and equality. Find them, connect with them, learn from each other, support each other. And together we can create the world that Dr. King dreamed of.
We can make that dream a reality.
That's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us.